This is Gradowski of WeAreChange.org, and of course a lot of news is coming out of Africa with 3 U.S. soldiers that just died in Niger, the United States building a drone base, and of course the major terrorist attack that just happened in Somalia, Mogadishu, that has killed over 300 and plus people. But the story that we're getting in the United States is of course a lot different from what is actually happening on the ground.
I am so sorry these 4 men died in operations, but I will say this about the operations, and I can't give you the details. They died in the defense of America. This war is getting hot in places where it's been cool, and we got to go where the enemy takes us.
And to talk about that, I have my good friend Mark Alabella here, who just came from Somalia, Mogadishu, and was just at the hotel from the major terrorist attack that was just bombed in Mogadishu, Somalia. And Mark, what were you doing in Somalia?
Well, I was just visiting because I had to make sense of what's happening on the ground pretty much. And I visited, and there's only really 2 or 3 big hotels that welcome foreigners. And I was at that very hotel. There's 2 of them. There's the Safari Hotel, there's the Sahafi Hotel. A few hours after I left, the whole thing was bombed out of existence, unfortunately. A lot of terrorism, but I think these things need to be explained. They need to be introduced in a different light, and I think it's important for us to take a few minutes to talk about what really happened. But the whole city, the downtown, it's a small city, all of it was just blown out of existence, unfortunately, just recently.
I mean, the story we're getting from Somalia in the United States is that it's just a bad place with pirates and terrorists, but the story is a lot more complicated than what we're getting from what you experienced down there. Starting off with the Somali fishermen and of course the terrorist organizations and their finances against people who actually support them, not for terrorism, but for other reasons, as you told us.
Well, the story is not very different. It's the opposite. Like, it couldn't be 180 degrees on the other end of what the real story is. All the megacorp boats, if you can just go and look at all the thousands of companies that are quoted on the U.S. market, get military support pretty much to go in places where technically they shouldn't be. It's not their lands to fish, and all these megacorp go and scoop the entire ocean. And they, all these companies, mostly U.S. companies, European companies, Japan is complicit. They just go and it's bottom scooping. They destroy the entirety of the ocean, and by doing so, it's free, cheap supply for all these companies in the U.S. that we know, the McDonald's and whatever, who needs to sell their McFish or whatever the name is for $2 or $3 a pop, and they have to go and loot and rob the oceans of the planet, and they don't care if they destroy the corporate. Now is not corporate anymore. It's not a private entity. It's not free market at all. If anything, it's a fascist system because the government is in bed and it's backing up. And what happened is a lot of poor Somali fishermen unfortunately got angry at these megacorp boats destroying the entire ocean and scooping all of the shrimps, the crab, the fish, and destroying everything that came with it. They try to protest. At first, the size of the boats, if you look at, any TV, you'll see them on YouTube. The boats that come from the U.S. are these mega, they look like gigantic Darth Vader-ish, boats. And these fishermen from Somalia are in these, wooden boats that fit 3 people at tops. These people tried to rebel. The big boats started water cannoning all of them out of, their sight. The poor fishermen were losing their job. They were losing their food pretty much. So what they did is they came back with guns. They came back in an attempt to fight back. And they were angry because they were seeing their biggest... by the way, South Africa is thought to have the biggest coast, but actually it's Somalia that has the biggest coast of all the 55 countries in Africa. So they came back with guns. They started shooting. It was disruptive to the good functioning of all these megacorp boats that wanted to rob and loot all the fish and the crabs and all these things. So what happened is the U.S. decided to ask for Somalia to intervene. Somalia said, no, we are going to back these fishermen, unfortunately. What the U.S. did then is it sent Somalia on its Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, which finds its roots in the Trading with the Enemy Act. So what happens is the U.S., the OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, allows Washington to dictate any bank around the world who they want to starve. So let's say tomorrow the U.S. is not, doesn't like what Iran is doing or what Somalia is doing. Barack Obama or Trump today, he signs a letter saying, I declare all the citizens of this country to be an enemy to freedom, and any bank facilitating a wire for a corporation, a resident, a citizen will be seen as an enemy of the United States. And what happens is that sends the whole country, which is not being cooperative with the U.S., on the bank carjack arrest. It implodes pretty much. They can't import toilet paper, water, nothing, the whole country freezes and implodes pretty much on itself. So the Somali government could not back the fishermen. The UN mirrored the acts of Washington. So the U.S., which decided to starve the poor country of Somalia, the UN decided to do the same thing. Before you know it, all these fishermen, the poor fishermen, were imprisoned. So the UN and the US and the European forces were complicit in taking all these poor fishermen, 500 men, and their only, job was to fish for the country. All of them imprisoned. It left, God knows how many orphans on the beaches of Somalia. And today, the megacorps have the last word. So the U.S. won. The media then, the Murdochs and all these Fox and CNN and other, once again, they look like corporate media, but they're not corporate media. They're just, state media pretty much. It's a state apparatus. Makes the entire planet listen to the fact that Al-Shabaab and all these people are terrorists, when in reality, the irony is Al-Shabaab gets most of its funding from shops. So it's private cash from local businessmen who actually agree willingly to fund because they need the defense, they need the help, they need the support to help them fight against these corporate boats that come and destroy and loot the ocean out of the might of the military which backs them.
Out of these fallen four, the American public needs to get ready for more operations, not less. We're going to build on what President Obama did in some of these countries. We're probably going to go to other places because that's where the enemy is taking us. We're going to be more aggressive.
What's really interesting is the United States kind of involvement in Africa. They did set up AFRICOM, their kind of central command in Africa. They are operating with a lot of forces with a lot of different countries in Africa. 3 U.S. soldiers were just killed in Niger. And of course, this latest terrorist attack in Mogadishu in Somalia, that you were there right before happened. Now we're hearing reports that this was a kind of retaliation from a local tribe after a failed U.S. raid in Somalia that killed 10 innocent civilians, which set the kind of local tribes in Somalia to commit this larger, bigger terrorist attack. How do you see the role of the kind of U.S. military and the disinformation that we're getting about their involvement in Africa?
So the people in Africa have successfully, until 2011-12, pretty much until the death of Gaddafi, they've successfully refused U.S. Presence in Africa. And so the U.S., interestingly enough, AFRICOM, which is one of the big 6 or 9 poles of control, AFRICOM has its headquarters in Germany, in Stuttgart, instead of having them in Africa, because most of the countries in Africa rejected them. Now, the irony is the first African American president, since Reagan, they've tried to kill this Gaddafi guy. Since 1986, they've tried to get Libya and this guy who was against U.S. presence, military, with foot on the ground. They've tried to kill Gaddafi. Everyone from Reagan from 1986, they've bombed his palace, they've killed his kids. The only administration that finally succeeded in killing this man who was rejecting U.S. presence in Africa, the administration was the first African-American president, Obama, with Clinton. Maybe you remember her saying, we came, she was laughing, we came, we saw, and we killed him, or we won, or something to that effect in an interview, with the arrogance of her playing the empress. The U.S. is increasingly present in Africa. What is interesting also is the U.S. hides. So it plays this stealth mode, which is something which is unique. If you study all these other empires in the history of humanity, if you look at the Roman Empire, if you look at other empires that have built with time in Asia, even the Japanese Empire, it was very clear what was happening. Nobody had a doubt who was the military, who was the bad guy, how things were portrayed. today, this century, we're going through a very unique empire building scenario, which is that the U.S. is successfully, through a lot of think tanks, a lot of media control, and maybe it was the same thing back then, but the U.S. is successfully convincing people that they are the good guys. So if you listen even to the narratives which is sold, in Somalia, for example, the recent government, which was invited to power, is a puppet to the U.S. So we're back to the scenarios that we've heard about in Iran and other places, and so the government now is helping the U.S. So the U.S. is increasingly trying to position itself in Africa. I think Africa has been very friendly also with China up until the recent years, and this has invited a lot of good cash to leave Africa to go towards China instead of going towards U.S. Companies. But increasingly, I mean, I was in Kenya, for example. You go to the supermarket, take a bottle of water, flip it, owned by Pepsi Cola or by all these big Coca-Cola company. You turn the chocolate bar, it's owned by Mars. All the 4,000 companies, slowly but surely, they walk into the fabric of the society, and they loot on both ends. So the companies that do resource grabbing are there and backed by the military, and the companies that resell their shitty products, the pops that aren't worth all that much, the chocolate, all the medicine, get a free access or get an easy access to the market.
Well, it's what we learned from Economic Hitman, Mr. Perkins, and the great book that he released. With everything that's happening kind of behind the scenes with people, mass corporations bribing them or using the threat of a gun to institute more power and control over other foreign lands. We did see China also set up a military base in Africa, just like the United States did. We are seeing them also have a huge involvement. They just did a live fire drill in Africa as well. So you could see that it's definitely an area that a lot of global powers have interest in. But what was the kind of attitude, what is the kind of situation in Somalia now? What were the people telling you? Were they aware of this situation? And how do you see their government kind of moving forward?
The local people have a very limited understanding, and this is where, I mean, you have to bow because it's so well done. The whole thing is so intelligent. They control the media. CNN just signed a deal, I think, with Kenya Network News. So most of the news, they share some of the articles. They share, some of the filters are the same. And the people don't understand what's happening. But to come back to Somalia, it's fascinating because people are tired. If they have to choose between slavery and fighting and losing their lives and losing their son, human nature, at the end of the day, dictates that they will opt for slavery. And this is what's happening slowly. People have resigned. People are fearful of opening their mouth because they've had enough. And from both ends, if the U.S. boats loot, they lose, and if they rebel, they lose. And in the big equation, take my money. Just stop torturing us, stop killing us, because even Al-Shabaab, even the rebels, proves to be a very destructive behavior. So the people are tired. Look at Somalia. Send them all the love you have, and I invite you to travel there. And unless people in the West, the job you do, and unless we try to agree that we should stop looting these countries, and we don't need the McFish at $2.50. We'll pay $4. Please stop killing people abroad and stop looting and stop destroying the ocean. These politicians who talk about the very Obama and all these people who speak about the weather and all these things. They could not be more hypocritical if they tried, pretty much. From one hand, from the back, they loot the ocean, they destroy all of it to finance wars and killing people and imprisoning poor people, shooting them, droning them, looting the ocean. And when they're on camera, they talk about, we're going to tax you more because we care about the weather. The whole thing is a huge farce, and I think it's time we stop and we pause and we reflect a little bit on what's happening, because a lot of people are suffering because of this giant circus.
A lot of the stuff that you shared today, I had no idea about. So I want to kind of thank you for sharing your insight, and if you have anything else to say about your experience in Somalia, I just kind of want to give you the microphone to share that.
I invite everyone to travel as much as possible. Go and visit Africa. Go now, go today. It's an amazing continent. It's an amazing people. They're much more, and I invite you to travel. It will be good for you. It will be good for the people there, because the people there also needs that refreshing exchange of resources, of discussions. And only through traveling do you get this alchemy of discussions where people wake up to the fact that they had everything wrong. You said, what I'm saying today is a bit news, but it was news to me also. Before I went to Somalia, I left there convinced that Somalia was nothing but a country of pirates. So I invite everyone to travel as much as possible. Don't waste your money on anything, and just take every penny you have and invest it in traveling. It's the only way to live. It's the only way to, especially today, the nomadic lifestyle will prove to be a healthy thing for a lot of people to do. But forget that aspect. Traveling is a cure and is the only solution ultimately.
Definitely a cure against ignorance. Some advice that I have taken very seriously, as you can see where I am right now. This information is very important. If you found it important as well, please share it with your friends and family members. I want to thank you guys so much for watching and supporting Real Independent Media. Thank you.